I'm Azam Nirmandiraj.
You'll have to really shout.
I know. I mean, that would be hard. I don't have big lungs. I am Azam Nirmandiraj, coordinator for Amnesty International Local Group 139 in Madison, Wisconsin. I have been born and raised in Iran. Came here in 1966 for my education. Ever since, as an adult, I started to analyze what is the politics, what is the justice, what is the human rights. I learned that, beginning, that the world is divided into two, parts, as it was said, But now, as I'm getting older and more involved with the amnesty groups and many other, as a citizen in this country, I have realized that it's really the international cooperations which is buying our government, interest groups, and they are really everywhere. And they are the ones, who are affecting, so-called war and peace in the world. So I think my solution, obviously, is never military, because being in Iran, I know what the human effect of it can be. But I think, it is education, just like the way we are doing right now, but not just to ourselves, because we are kind of informed, public, but to the general public, and also to have a way of relying our intent to our representative. They are the ones, who are actually, are making decisions, on how much money should go where and to the military. And just say that we do not want our money to go and be spent on these. We do not need to be the world police, and we want, do to others as you want them to do to you. We want, peace for everyone, not just for ourselves. And lastly, we should change our lifestyle, because the way what we are enjoying in this country and in other free world is because of the resources that we are using from all other countries, whether it is the Middle East, whether it is the Africa, whether it is Arctic, all these areas, resources we are using in order to keep our lifestyle.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That's a great point. So how I want to do this, we're going to open it up to general questions and comments. So I'm going to take a couple, maybe 3 sort of questions, comments from the audience, and please, when you speak, just let us know if you want to direct your question or comment towards a particular panelist or not. And then after getting a couple of questions or comments from the audience, then I'll go back and see if the panelist has any responses, and we'll just sort of go back and forth like that.
How about putting down the names of the people who speak so that everybody has a chance to do it?
The speakers list.
And
Yeah.
A stack.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
I think
So you, and then Barb, and then Ellen. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to take a slightly different position than
Maybe
anybody
it's
else.
allowed.
It's best,
Completely different.
it's best to
I
stay
think
there.
that I would champion from the very beginning a peaceful solution, not only on moral grounds, which is obvious, but on practical grounds. There really were from the very beginning only 2 possible forces of real military power in Syria. One was the Assad government, and the other were the jihadi side. But for all their dedication and heroism, the democratic secularist side was not composed of people who were ready to fight a war, who were capable of fighting a war. You don't get heavy weapons, use heavy weapons, unless you're trained. And they were not, unlike the jihadis, unlike Assad, they were never in a position to fight a war against Assad. The jihadis barely were. And what we've seen happen is we've seen the secular forces have now given up, essentially. They've been absorbed into the jihadi organizations, or they've gone home. There's really only two left now, jihadi and Syrian army. So best bet from the very beginning, I think it was probably obvious to everyone who wanted to see a decent outcome. The best bet was to have a diplomatic struggle, not a military struggle. The military struggle is going to be a disaster. It is a disaster.
Great. And I have Barb and then Alan, and then just to keep things, that was a great length. So just to keep things moving and more interactive, we're asking for this portion to both audience members and panelists to keep remarks to a couple minutes. Thank you.
I'm Barbara Nichols, and I'm president of the UNA Dane County chapter, and I have a question. It's an operational and a definitional question. Would the panel please explain the operational definition they are using when they say this is a proxy war? I think there are multiple definitions, so I need to know when you are using that, what is the reference point? Proxy war. Thank you. That's what's left of my New England accent.
Thanks, Barbara.
That was a good one.
And Alan?
Yeah, I think I can speak from back here. Actually, I have some definition of question as well. One is, I want to know what the West is. Right? It's an ideological construct, and I don't know how to understand it otherwise. Secondly, to talk about a nation being anti-imperialist, from my understanding of the term, is that you also have to be anti-capitalist, right? Opposed to the highest stage of capitalism. Secondly, I want to caution, because running through this book, in almost every instance, somebody throws around the notion of humanitarian intervention. As I said on my program on work with Danny and Hashemi the other day, humanitarian intervention is an oxymoron. Because that too is an ideological and political construct which the United States and the imperial powers use on a pick and choose basis. Okay? When Samantha Power, the major figure that's put forward the responsibility to respond,
Protect. R2P.
She was sitting with military leaders at Harvard, right, strategizing the U.S. goal. Now another final point that I'm required. I don't know what a call for arming democratic secular forces coming from us means, right? Because that would mean having to shape and push and prod and affect either U.S. policy, right? And so now I agree, David, I agree that it's the right of these people to get weapons where they can. But I don't know at this point what that means anymore, right? There was one other point, I'm sorry, but again, I urge people to be on guard, certainly around the whole discourse on humanitarian intervention. Again, it's an imperial construct, and we have to be on guard against it and to critique it continually. Thank you.
trying to figure out amplification back here. So let's go back and let's give a couple minutes for the panelists to make responses to those comments and questions, and then we'll go back to the audience for see if there's more questions or comments. So who would like to?
Well, I don't know your name, but the first speaker was raising the point that the secular forces had no weapons and training and couldn't really possibly carry out a successful war, if I could paraphrase you. So when the American Revolution started against the greatest empire in the world, they didn't have heavy artillery. They didn't have great armies. They went up against the biggest army in the world, the biggest empire in the world. When the working people of Paris went up against the government in 1848 and 1871, they didn't have the biggest armies, but they did start out with popular support. They did start out with a section of the population that was ready to fight. And they did use a political strategy to isolate their enemies and to build their supporters, and to use a military strategy that started from their weakness but could build on their strengths, to generalize and to be a little bit empty about it. When the Vietnamese fought against the Chinese for hundreds of years, against the French very successfully in the 50s, and against the US very successfully in the 60s and 70s, the Vietnamese didn't have B-52s, they didn't have artillery. They did get support from Russia and China, that's true, but they didn't start out as equal fighting forces. Revolutionary forces, always and of necessity, are going to be militarily weaker against the states that are representing the classes that oppress us. That is not necessarily a reason that we have to lose. That's all. I'll just leave that at that.
I'll stand up too. I agree. I think diplomacy is the only possible answer. I don't see that, the Quakers have a wonderful bumper sticker. It's called "War is not the answer," and I think that's true. In terms of proxy war, I think how I would define it is when you have parties at war, but really the funding and the support is coming from people outside. I think Central America was a key example of how it was an internal civil war, whether you want to look at El Salvador, Nicaragua, or whatever, but we were funding one side. And so that's, I guess, how I would define it. And I agree with you. I somehow, for me, the R2P, the responsibility to protect, I don't see how you do that militarily. And it's come about because most of our wars now, actually, are not wars between countries. They're civil wars, internally. And usually between the haves and the have-nots. And it is usually big countries. I mean, even the International Criminal Court, which I support, you look at the people who've been indicted. They're primarily the countries of Africa, and it was used against the former Yugoslavia. And it has been big countries sort of picking on littler countries. And I think that is a reality. And so I have a problem, too, with this responsibility to protect and get involved in internal wars. I think that's all I want to say.
Well, I'd like to start by addressing that proxy war question as well. I didn't use the term proxy war. I said proxy army. I don't see, people have referenced earlier the international laws that govern war, and there are international laws that govern war. When a country is under attack by foreign armies, they have the right to request and receive military aid from allies. The Syrian government is under attack by foreign-backed armies. And I want to say why I use the term proxy armies is you have to recognize what the situation the United States is in today. The United States has been forced backward. They have taken great losses. The U.S. government has taken great losses militarily and politically since 9/11. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq did not work out the way they thought they were going to work out. And the reason they didn't is because the people of those countries were willing to fight and die in order to, keep, whatever, it's their countries. They fought and died, and they're still fighting and dying. So the United States, politically, can no longer invade with its own army. They can't do it. They can't do it logistically. They can't do it politically. So instead, they're turning to black ops, drone warfare, and proxy wars. And what they're doing in Syria is a proxy war. I also want to actually respond to this, brother. I didn't get your name.
Joe.
Joe. I'm Joe as well. My tocayo. So I'm sorry, proxy armies. They're using their proxy armies to fight their wars. Sorry. I don't think that Russia and Iran providing aid to. I don't think that qualifies this as a proxy war. It's proxy armies. If it is, it's a one-sided proxy war by the U.S. only. Anyway, but I think you have a very sober assessment of what has actually happened in Syria over the last 2 years. I think there is no middle ground. And if there are independent forces, political forces, they will have no role whatsoever when and if the Assad government falls at the hands of those foreign-backed armies. Syria was not a utopia. It's not socialist. When I say I'm an anti-imperialist, I'm an anti-capitalist. I believe they're anti-imperialist. They're clearly a capitalist country. But but again, that's not why the United States is against them. And I think what happened is, and just to say, to mention this too, the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian National Council, their program for economic recovery, and they have one, is basically to go back to doing what Assad was doing, which caused the uprising against Assad. They want to open the economy to the IMF and the World Bank and to the Western capitalist governments. There's no independent influence on those people. They are puppets of the United States and the Gulf Coordinating Council and Turkey. So, and I'll take my turn.
First on Joe Dean's question. The Free Syrian Army was actually formed of defectors from the professional Syrian Army. So the core of the FSA were people who were trained militarily. Okay, and beyond that, a lot of ordinary Syrian people, teachers, lawyers, doctors, workers, artisans, peasants, and so on, joined. I mean, it was an uprising that was nationwide, although it was predominantly in the rural areas where the economy had been ruined by a combination of climate change-induced drought and the failure of the Assad regime, which held back the wheat reserves that they had when people were going hungry because they wanted to speculate in the world market. Joe mentioned the right of the Syrian government to get aid from its allies. The Syrian government is an illegitimate, minority-based family mafia-run concern. There hasn't been a free election in Syria in 43 years. The government has no legitimacy, has no right to sovereignty of any sort, as far as I'm concerned. And I think that it's an open question as to whether or not if the West, and basically I mean Western imperialism, United States, Europe, mainly. Okay, I'm sorry. I agree, Alan. Thank you. I mean, I was using it in a very fuzzy sense, but I think it's an open question as to whether they could have toppled the Assad regime early on. The Assad regime was caught off balance, and this army that couldn't fight, without jihadis, fought very hard for a year and a half, 2 years, fought against a heavily armed war machine that was bombing them with attack aircraft, heavy artillery, Scud missiles, flattening entire urban districts and towns, destroying the infrastructure, shooting it, creating free fire zones all over Syria. And the Syrian rebels fought this professional army practically to a standstill. Okay, I think it's an open question as to whether or not they could have won. Now, what now? Okay, what now? I mean, Assad has managed, with resupply from Russia and Iran, and because of the sectarian nature that the war has taken, he has managed to, at least for the time being, to consolidate a grip over the western urban spine, the urban spine of cities that runs down through western Syria. Okay, much of the 40% of the rest of the country is under rebel control. Okay, there's a tremendous fight going on in Aleppo, which is the biggest city in Syria, not Damascus. And what can we hope? What can the Syrian revolution hope for? What could we hope for? If Assad wins, we can be sure of two things. One, there will be a massacre of all of the opposition, or almost all of the opposition, civilian or military, if they cannot escape the country. Okay, and that includes the civil society activists and elements of the left that are our counterparts in Syria. And there will be a reconsolidation of a cruel dictatorship, crony capitalist dictatorship that for decades to come. Okay, Syria will descend once more into darkness. What are the alternatives? I think the alternatives are that if the rebels can hang on, okay, that eventually the United States, which has only supported this rebellion half-heartedly, the United States and Russia, because of the destabilizing effects in the region, are going to force Assad and the Iranians to the negotiating table, and one of two things will happen. Either there'll be an agreement to set in motion some sort of long-term transition to some kind of democracy or power sharing, or there could be a partition of Syria. I passed out this thing imagining a revamped Middle East at the beginning of the forum, and I would suggest you take a look at it because it's not entirely implausible that some of these nation states that were created by Western colonialism, are going to break down, and we're going to have smaller nation states, which is very plausible at a time of runaway climate change, water shortages, depletion of fossil fuels, and all the other things that are going to probably take down a lot of the nation states in the world, including maybe eventually ours. Okay, so I think that if Assad does not win, then and there's some kind of peace accord, millions of Syrians will return to their homes, and I think it will be very unlikely that a few thousand jihadis are going to hold sway over them for very long.
Thank you. A really quick addition, and then we'll go back to the audience.
The point was made that there really, in effect, there is no significant fighting force outside of the jihadis and the Assad regime. Actually, that's not true. You may be familiar with the name Jane. This is an organization that keeps track of military situation in the world and who's got what navies and what ships and aircraft carriers and all that. So Jane's got a terrorism and insurgency center. They published an article recently on the specific nature and composition of the insurgency. And according to this, nearly half are jihadists or hardline Islamists, and the other half are who? They're these deserters who came over to the popular revolution and the people who took up arms who were civilians. And so they do exist, and there are about 35 to 40,000 of them roughly who are fighting. Yes, there are great limitations as well as pressures. As I said, there's not one country in the world that supports them. Because they represent a popular revolution that's a threat to the established order everywhere. When we saw Occupy, which was not an armed movement in this country at all, reach out to people on a basis that was very strong in terms of pointing out the 1/10 and 1% who run this country and the power that they have and how harmful they are, they got over 70% popular support in the ratings. Wherever there were demonstrations, soldiers came out in uniform to protect them from the police. The level of the chord that they touched in people on basically class issues, but also their anti-racism, was fabulous. And what was the response in this country? Every city in the country, in a relatively coordinated and quick fashion, did what? Mobilized police forces and judges to break down our settings and our outposts and stuff where people were having their first opportunity to participate in real decision making and real beginnings of power. Well, what's my point? Part of my point is that not only do these forces exist, that they're indigenous, that they're armed, and that they have enemies on all sides, but they are themselves fighting against the jihadi forces. So it's a civil war within a civil war. And that, let's not lose sight of it, and let's not take in these characterizations such as we've heard at the table, that this is just a proxy war, and that there is no other third force. The fact is the revolutionary forces, which are very limited politically, as Joe said. I'm a socialist. I think the only alternative to imperialism is socialism. I think rather than state socialism, it has to be a socialism of the working class and not for the working class, because we have to run things for ourselves. Even given their limitations, nevertheless, they're fighting against the same forces and in the same direction of a liberated life, and that they are fighting, and we should not accept characterizations that deny their existence and their fight, and that we should aid them with solidarity. Thank you.
Thanks. And let's go back to the audience. Any further questions? Okay, so I'm going to go first for folks who haven't talked yet. So I will move down this row and then in the back.
Let me stand up over here. I'm having some back trouble, so I may need the chair.
What's your name?
Oh, my name's Paul Beckett, and I feel we're beginning to look more at possible outcomes, shift from the kind of background, how did this happen, and sort of who did what, and to some extent who's to blame. But I want to backtrack on that. I think we should look at outcomes. But it seems to me, I think you people did a really good job. And let me say that I've been arguing with David a little bit by email for some time, and I find a lot less to differ with you now that I really understand your position better. I thought it was very good. There's one thing that's been left out though, and that's the I word, and I'm just kind of surprised. And I don't know how many people here will agree with me. And let me say, my sort of hard evidence for what I'm about to say is zero. But I was thinking when Bonnie raised the question, the old question of who benefits, which can be so useful when you're looking at confused situations. The country that I think of that clearly benefits the most from this is Israel, without any question. And I would say that what is going on in Syria is an extraordinarily complex thing, in part civil war, in part maybe proxy armies, in part this, in part that. But I think in part it also is part of the long war that is a very determined war that Israel is carrying out to bring down Iran and to make sure Iran is never a competitor for real power in the Middle East with Israel. And so looking at it from that standpoint, I think you see the U.S. almost a little bit as a proxy for Israel, as I think we often are when it comes to Middle East policy. And there is a kind of strange alliance, which may not be so terribly strange, between the reactionary Sunni regime dictatorships in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the smaller states, and Israel, because their interests in this respect are the same, because those states also are very, very nervous about Israel and don't like Israel. It also ties into the Sunni-Shiite divide, which I don't want to go into, and I don't think probably any of us want to go into that, although I think it's probably more important to people in the region than it is to us. But anyway, looking at it from that standpoint, one can see that suddenly Hezbollah is going to be disastrously weakened from the Hezbollah standpoint. One of you quoted Nasrallah, very important factor for Israel. And again, it's a stepping stone, toward the final confrontation, I think, with Iran, which Israel is constantly trying to enlist us in.
Thank you for
Thank
that,
you, Paul.
Paul. I have David, Lars, and Tom before coming back to Joe. So, David?
I guess I have to be a little idealistic in what I'm going to say. And I appreciate all this discussion about what's going on in Syria, and of course it reflects on the whole world and everything. But I'd like to know, in my mind, where any of this goes at the end of a bayonet. All right. In my mind, I hear what you're saying. I understand that the world isn't perfect, what we want it to be. But in my mind, until we quit talking about all this militarism, no matter what side it's coming from, whether you're a socialist or whatever you are, imperialist, whatever, until you start getting out of that thought process, I can't see where any of this shit makes a difference, you know? So like if say for instance in Syria, if we just reflect around that area, what happens, say if the rebels are successful in overthrowing Assad militarily? What does that gain for you overall? What can it gain for anybody in the world? Okay, and that's why I said it's a bit of an idealistic statement, because I don't believe in warfare and I don't believe in killing. So to me, when you're on that method, and that's where we've been pretty much since the beginning of humanity, until we change our entire thought process, what we have in our hearts and our souls, this sort of situation continues to happen. So I think we have to start thinking outside of the militaristic solution and get back into total diplomacy. That's about it.
Thank you. And have Lars?
Yeah, my name is Lars, and I speak for myself. I don't represent veterans. We've had, 237 years, give or take a half a dozen, of warfare in the United States. We have been imperialists and aggressors. We killed 100 million Native Americans in genocide. We've got a deplorable history. I don't see anything being accomplished by creating more warfare. I see more problems being created, and I just don't understand why we should get involved in Syria or in any other nation's problems. Why don't we stay here and take care of our own problems? We got Nazis in the White House. We got Nazis here at the Capitol building. Why don't we concentrate on cleaning up these problems, and then maybe we can think about getting involved in other nations.
Thank you. And Tom, and then coming back to Joe.
Well, I have more comments than anything else. The first thing is, as has been said, where's Iraq? And of course, you mentioned that about, well, this side or that side. The second thing that I've learned is you're either for war or you're against war. You can't be down the middle. You can't say, well, this is a good war, this is a bad war, we're helping people here, humanitarian, but over here we're not. So I think that's the second thing, and I think that was brought up. And it seems to me in this country, the American people love them. They like fighting, they like killing. You can see it in the movies, the DVDs, in the military, et cetera, even in the veterans, whether they come back from war, they just want more. And I guess the last thing I want to say is, as an American, we will always be drawn into whatever conflict there is, because our position in the world is always what can we get out of it, and regardless of the cost, meaning the cost of Vietnam was high in money itself, yet the Vietnamese at the present time are slaves making a Nike shoes and whatever for the United States. And we could have had that without the war if the United States had said, okay, well, we'll give them capitalism and they'll be satisfied. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And Joe?
Yeah, I'll try and be brief instead of go.
I'd stand up.
Stand up, stand up.
I think that the struggle between the jihadi rebels and the Free Syrian Army, the secularists, is settled. It's over. The jihadis have won. the other side has given up. That is the truth. Whatever you want to say about how rebels they can fight on forever and ever when they can, but they've lost this war. That's number one. Number two, the United States is not in the slightest bit interested in standing behind a viable democratic force. It's the last thing they want in the Middle East. They agree with that, which means that I think that's the reason why, that was one of the reasons why they didn't support them. The other reason was any weapons that went to the FSA people were going to wind up eventually, if they were significant, with the jihadis. The jihadis just it may have been a minority, but they were the organized minority, and they were they didn't need any more weapons than they had to win, so they won. It's demonstrated. So the only chance that I think people who are in favor of some sort of humanitarian solution was to have emphasized diplomacy from the very beginning, to see what you could do to stop the U.S. from giving weapons over there, which we're not going to do anybody.
I'm going to go first this time.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I agree with Paul about Israel. I think, there have been calls for a nuclear-free Middle East since 1953, I think it is, or 73. Israel is the only country there that has nuclear weapons. It is also the only country in the area that has not signed the chemical weapons ban and has chemical weapons. So one thing I think that we can do to help Syria is to stop military aid and all of the aid we give to Israel. I mean, we are the ones who give aid and comfort to Israel in the United Nations. There's dozens of Security Council resolutions that call on Israel to, end the settlements, take down the wall, not do targeted assassinations, all that stuff. And we veto the enforcement of any of those resolutions. So Israel is a part of the problem. I think the other issue, and that shows our double standard, is the fact that that Iran, which has, at this point, is doing what's perfectly legal of enriching uranium, and they say for peaceful uses, we say for nuclear weapons, but we have imposed sanctions on Iran at the same time that Israel is not part of a nuclear test ban treaty, of the whole non-proliferation treaty, and it hasn't allowed inspections, hasn't allowed anything. So, I think our policies towards both Israel and Iran are wrong. And I think that they do have an impact on what's happening in the rest of the Middle East, in Syria as well. The whole issue of militarism, we haven't talked at all. It's sort of like either we support the secular and moderate opposition, or we have to do military stuff. Look at the fall of communism. That came about, whether you look at solidarity in Poland, whether you look at bringing down the Berlin Wall and ending that communism in East Germany. There's wonderful stories out of Leipzig. They had years of Monday peace prayers that became a safe space because in the churches you could organize. And they organized everybody, and then they did marches right after. And the Stasi, the police, or the secret police, after said, we were all prepared for bombs, but we didn't know what to do about candles and peace. Because, when people carry candles, they have to keep them from blowing out, and so they can't be throwing stuff. There are nonviolent ways of bringing about dramatic social change. Look at here. The abolition of slavery, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, all of those came about. And there was some violence, usually on the part of the police, but nonviolent movements of social change. And I think that's what we've got to figure out how to support. Gandhi had this wonderful idea that you should have people trained in every community to support nonviolence. And then when another community was overwhelmed, you sent those people in effect, peacekeepers. And I'm not always wildly enthused about the UN peacekeepers because they have some issues. But there are ways of supporting without asking to arm. Because it's like throwing gasoline in a fire. The more guns you have, we see that here in our, we have war in our streets, literally. And we have certain groups who are making money off of manufacturing weapons, and so we don't, and the NRA, which speaks for them, and so we don't get gun control. I think that it takes movements of people, and we got to deal with that. The other thing, I agree with you, Lars, about, we've got to start here at home, because our militarism and the fact that half of our income tax dollars go to war, and the fact that we have doubled our military budget since 9/11. What that means is your only tool is a hammer. You see a lot of nails that need pounding. And it is our immediate response to things that we got to somehow, do military action, and there's nothing else that's effective. And I think that whole issue of jihadis, it happened in Afghanistan. The Taliban came to power after the war, the Soviet war, which destroyed a lot of their infrastructure and has really resulted in them being a narco state. Because poppies are what grows after you've destroyed the irrigation system and the farming. And so we need to look much deeper, I think, than a superficial, who's got the most guns and who's going to win. Because I think the only way forward is a nonviolent, diplomatic, getting a ceasefire, doing diplomacy, getting countries that are, bringing in fighters to stop already. And I think that I was interested this time that public opinion seemed to have something to say. The Congress wasn't so, there was not a vote, but it's quite likely that the Congress wouldn't have supported it. And remember in Iraq, we had 15 million people in the streets of the world, and the Bush administration didn't listen. And I think you could say maybe the Obama administration listened a little bit. And so I think, there are alternatives.
I'd like to go next. I want to pick up on this point. In all of the organizing that we do in Chicago, with every anti-war demonstration, when we marched against NATO, when we marched against going to war with Syria, or for the U.S. providing weapons to the rebels in Syria, when we march against drone warfare, we always raise economic slogans, money for jobs, healthcare, education, whatever, not war. And in fact, it was those slogans which united so many people to march against NATO. When NATO announced they were coming to Chicago, most people in the anti-war movement couldn't say what NATO stood for. Most people thought it was North American something, So, but it was because, we were able to, if I had $1 trillion, right? We were able to unite the teachers union, SEIU, not the Central Labor Council, but a lot of other unions in Chicago to join that, and community groups that were struggling against, for example, the closure of schools and mental health clinics. So I agree 100%. That's part and parcel of our efforts. I wish Joe was here because I'd like to go back to his, again, what I think is a very sober assessment of what's really going on. I just want to say, too, not only are the jihadis the most proficient, the most capable fighters in the rebels' raid against the government, and that's not because their ideology is superior. It's because they have 10 years of training in Iraq. Those people have been fighting, in Iraq, and not just fighting the U.S. occupation, fighting the other forces, fighting against the forces that are Shia, based. Anyway, they're hardened fighters. So they come across the border into Syria, and they bring that battlefield training with them. That's why they're winning first and foremost. But the reason, and Joe said it a bit ago, but the majority of the people of Syria have already made a decision. They oppose the rebellion. They support the government. And they might not have supported the government 2 years ago, but they support them now because because it's not just the radical jihadis, it's the whole Free Syrian Army supports the slogans, Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave. They chant this in their mass rallies. The government of Syria can't ever negotiate themselves out of office because they will be the ones massacred. And just one more thing. The most pro-rebel human rights group that tracks the deaths in Syria, and right now I'm forgetting their names, the name of their group, but it's a pro-rebel human rights organization, In the summer, they published their estimate of the deaths so far. 43% of the deaths so far are members of the Syrian military or the militia that works with the Syrian military. The second largest number of deaths are civilians, about 41%. The minority of deaths are the fighters in the rebel army. This is the reality. It is people resisting the foreign armies that have died and died and died. And that's why the people of Syria are rallying around their sovereign government to defeat the foreign-backed regime. That's regimes that are waging war on them.
Oh, I was going to wait, but I can't wait now. That's just the most misleading and accurate statement that I've heard today. To say that the civilians are the ones who are being killed is true. To say that the civilians have been killed by the rebels in the large part is just beyond ludicrous. Who was it that the government was bombing with their aircraft, with their artillery, and with their missiles? Civilian areas that were supporting the rebels. Did they have the support of people in Syria? Where do you think those 40,000 FSA fighters came from? They were deserters from the army. If you desert the army, you take your life in your hands. There's no going back. Deserters are killed in any army, in any warfare that exists. For 30 to 40,000 people to desert an army in the field at time of war is a huge political statement. The United States got out of Vietnam when the anti-war movement moved into the army, into the military, into the Navy, into the Air Force, into the intelligence sections, to where the soldiers were refusing to fight, were killing officers and non-coms who were forcing them to fight, and who were sabotaging the United States military from within the military. If you don't know anything about it or you don't believe it, there's a movie that does a very good job of tracing it, even though it's only half true. What it says, it's called Sir, No Sir, and I encourage you to see it. That's when armies fall apart. That's politics in the field. And the reality is the masses of civilians are not being killed by the rebel armies. The masses of, despite the outrages of the jihadis who do massacre people on a religious basis, the vast majority of those people killed were killed by who? By the aircraft, by the artillery, by the rockets, and by the chemical weapons of the Assad government. And to say otherwise is either to be unaware of reality or to be lying about reality. It's just not true.
Yes, Richard. First, on the question of nonviolence, there's no way that we're going to bring about major revolutionary change in this country by trying militarily to confront the American ruling class or its war machine. For that reason, on a tactical basis, I'm for a mass nonviolent civil resistance. And I think that there have been many examples around the world, and if you see the movie about Gene Sharp, the theorist of nonviolent civil resistance, How to Start a Revolution, it brings it home vividly, or you look at Gene Sharp's writings. I think that is the way that we need to go in this country, and people of many countries and many movements around the world need to go. That said, there are situations in which people are driven to take up arms to defend themselves, and Syria is a clear example of that. Now, because they had access to more arms and they had more experience fighting in other wars, it's true, the jihadis, have come to the forefront in terms of a combat role in Syria. But that's not to overlook that the non-jihadi element in the Syrian revolt is huge. I mean, half of the rebel coalition is made up of non-jihadis. Some of the soldiers who joined the jihadis joined them not because they were jihadis. They simply wanted to have access to arms. It's really hard to know exactly, how dominant or not dominant the jihadi element is. As far as what the people in Syria want, if you remember our own revolution, I was always taught in grade school that 1/3 of us were for it, 1/3 of us were against it, and 1/3 were in the middle going vacillating back and forth. Probably that's the situation in Syria right now. Okay, no, given the chaos and the terror and the war-torn situation, nobody knows exactly what the majority of the Syrian people want. The whole reason there's a revolt is so that the Syrian people can democratically decide, what they want in the future of their country. So, until that happens, we're not really going to know what they know. Maybe people are clinging, many of them, to what they perceive as the stronger side, in spite of the fact that they may have originally wanted the Assad mafia removed. Okay, so what are the best possible outcomes? If the Assad regime wins a civil war, they will wipe out the opposition. Syria will go back to being, a family dictatorship, for many years to come. On the other hand, if the Assad regime does not succeed in reimposing its control over the country, then I think and if there's some kind of a ceasefire, then I think you have a somewhat fluid situation in which there is possible space for democratic forces to develop. Okay, and as I said before, there'll be many people in Syria, in those areas, when they return to their homes, who are not going to want to live under jihadi rule. The jihadi rule in the north of Syria, where they're most dominant, is already being contested in many areas by civil society activists. Now, I want to Alan raised a good point, and that is that, what effect are we going to have? As I said, I don't think U.S. imperialism wanted the victory of the Syrian revolution, even when there was a chance that the democratic opposition would be in the forefront. And they've shown that by, the inadequate aid that's been given to the Syrian revolution. I think that basically they've hung the rebels out to dry. And I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. strikes some kind of deal with Russia and Iran and does more to stab the Syrian, revolt in the back. I wouldn't be surprised at all. I have taken the position that I have basically as a matter of principle, because I think we need to solidarize with the Syrian revolution no matter what its fate is. Okay? And even if I succeeded in winning all of you over to my position and all the whole anti-war movement and the American left, we're so marginalized that, I don't think that we could do more than, just simply educate people, in this country about, what's at stake in the Syrian revolution. The Syrian revolution is a mortal threat, not only to the Assad regime, and the client regimes of the Eastern imperialist bloc, as I like to call Russia and Iran and so on, but it's also a mortal threat to the Arab reactionary regimes. In the long run, it's a mortal threat to Zionism. Okay, because the Arab Sunni reactionaries are really riding the tiger, and there is actually one analyst I read was arguing that maybe the Saudis, are encouraging their proxy war in Syria in order to keep the jihadis from returning home to Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states. It's a good way to keep them occupied, to give the Shiite alliance a hard time, and also it's a good way for jihadis to get killed off. Okay, but if the Syrian revolt is successful or partially successful, I believe that it will be in the long run, despite the presence of the jihadis, it will be a blow for revolutionary change in the Middle East. And if it's defeated, the opposite will be the case.
Thanks. And let's go back to the audience, maybe one last round. Is there, Alan, anybody else with questions or comments?
I'll do one more.
All right.
I'm a product of Vietnam. I was in the Marine Corps. And I tell you what, folks.
Yeah, maybe face. Well,
And I tell you what, folks, I'm for peace. And I know that it's going to take a long time to reach that. And I'm willing to go out there and I'm willing to be civilly disobedient. I'm willing to be arrested. I'm willing to be hauled to jail. but we need an army of people that's willing to do that. As far as sitting around and having intellectual discussions about warfare, especially from people that probably have never been in the military, okay, fine, that's good. Let's have an intelligent discussion. But we got to get out in the street and we got to fight for it. Because it's not going to be given to us on a silver platter. We have to fight for it.
Thank you. And Alan?
Yeah, I just want to throw a couple other variables in here. This is, because we have, at some level, we have to understand this in a global context. Number one, as enunciated in the so-called Pacific pivot, the United States is moving from the Middle East to take on what it sees as the coming adversary, China. On China's west flank, Central Asia, conflict brewing there that few of us know about, and the Pacific pivot. I mean, it's got to the point now where a port of call for the U.S. Navy is Da Nang. Okay? Secondly, one of the standard U.S. tactical moves, articulated perhaps best by Henry Kissinger and then Brzezinski and so on, the realists, is what they call the stability of instability. Let them, Churchill said it back when, during World War II. Let them bleed each other white. Okay? That's the realist position. So if the U.S. is shifting its priorities, okay, now, I'm very pessimistic. Why? Because since the beginning of, since 2001, what came after, the military in the United States runs U.S. foreign policy. The State Department is dressing. All you have to do is look at the budgets. Okay? The CENTCOM commander that's running the show in the Middle East flies in his own plane the size of Air Force One, with hundreds of staff going with him. When the Secretary of State goes abroad, it's a very small staff, maybe a handful, and they stay in private hotel rooms, while the CENTCOM commanders stay in whole hotel suites. Right? That point is that, it gets back to this point, is that we agree that if the U.S. was concerned at all, despite all the claims and BS, with democratic, secular forces and so on, they would have armed them a long time ago. Right? They would have gone to their assistance a long time ago. They would have, but at some level, they see their big fight as it's not even Russia anymore. It's not even Russia anymore. China has surpassed Russia globally as investors throughout the global south, throughout Central Asia, and so on. The fight is coming with China, and which means, unfortunately, that peoples in the Middle East are superfluous. Now, one final comment. We have to resist. There's no longer the bipolar Cold War world, which means to talk about regimes such as the Saudis or the Gulf states, or for that matter, look at what's at South America, whatever. We have to stop this thing of the U.S. is the puppet master, right? These countries, these blocks, these sub-blocks, have their own regional agendas, and it's very difficult to decipher. I'm getting a hint. I've become a student of Central Asia. Don't ask me how or why. But it's so complex and so fucked up. so very messed up.
term.
Right.
There's no other way to use it. So okay, it's doing this G rating. But so I've already spoken enough. But again, the complexity of it and the fact that you're just saying, let them bleed it, to hell with them.
All right. So then, anyone else? So my suggestion is maybe we do the 5-minute closing statements by the panelists, incorporating any response to that. And then I'd also like to add my own request. We've mentioned the refugees, but we actually haven't spent a lot of time. So actually my request to the panelists is also in your 5-minute closing statement to also in some way talk about what, obviously, refugees need more support. What is or what should be the U.S. role that we should demand that our government do, regardless of all of the other considerations that we've been talking about today. So, and you've been really good at organizing yourselves into what order, so I'm not even going to go there.
Want to do reverse order?
Yes, that's fair.
I'm not,
Well, all right. I had the last one too long, so I'll let Joe have the last word.
No, it'll be.
I'll have the last
fine.
word.
Don't be so shy.
Although I'm a lifelong opponent of U.S. imperialism, I kind of like to use, I did use the gangster analogy before, that the world is dominated by two regional blocks of gangsters, a view that I think Alan has at least partially punctured. I'll have to think about this regional blocks thing, but maybe there's more gangsters than just the two main factions of gangsters. I like to use another analogy, and that's the Chicago cop analogy. Joe and I are from Chicago, so I guess we can commune on that level, especially since he's being targeted by the capitalist state.
Different wing of the capitalist
Right.
state.
And that is that I believe that the police, especially in a city like Chicago, they are a part of the problem. Okay, we have capitalist inequality, crisscrossed with ethnic and racial divisions. I have a lot of poverty, alienation, and frustration, and it breeds violence. Okay, and the police the primary responsibility is to protect capitalist private property, to protect the power structure, to enforce the dictates of the corporate ruling class, and to crack down. And so I think the police are part of the problem. But if I was in a situation, if I was back in Chicago, and it happened to me a couple of times, if I was in a situation where I thought somebody was being, savagely brutalized or possibly murdered, terrorized, that I call 911, in spite of the nature of the capitalist police, and that, in a way, is the way I see the world. Now, people who can accept that on a domestic level have a hard time getting their minds around it on an international level, because they still have this ideal about the sovereignty of nations and so on. But I really believe that the sovereignty of nations on an international level is a very vulnerable norm. The big powers violate it all the time when they want to violate it. Okay, and I don't think that if we all become nonviolent and pacifists, although I think that would be a good thing, anthropologically and in the long run, I think we're still in a situation where the cops rule, and I don't think American imperialism or Western imperialism is going to go away, anytime soon. Okay, we could try and restrain it from in situations where it's doing bad things, like we did in Vietnam. We can also try and suggest that it might do a few good things. I mean, I think to a limited extent, what happened in Bosnia and Kosovo, was a situation where the agenda of Western imperialism finally coincided with the need to save people, from ethnic cleansing and genocide. And I don't like necessarily the way it was carried out, but I think that some good came of it. Someday, runaway climate change, resource depletion,